Hey everybody, and welcome to Dominion Cards, the video series where we take a strategic, in-depth look at various cards from the board game Dominion. Today we're looking at Mill. This is a 4-cost action and victory card from the 2nd edition of Intrigue. It says +1 card, +1 action. You may discard 2 cards for 2 coins. It is also a victory card worth 1 point. So some quick notes on the functionality of this card. Discarding anything is totally optional, so you can play it just as what we call a do-nothing cantrip, which is just +1 card, +1 action. The card effectively replaces itself in your hand, and you don't have to discard anything at all. If you do choose to discard, you must try to discard 2 cards. So that can fail if, for example, Mill is the only card in your hand. You play it, you draw 1 card, then you only have 1 card in your hand to discard. In that case, you would discard that 1 card. However, you only get the money if you actually successfully discard 2 cards. So you wouldn't necessarily want to choose to discard in that case. When you first look at Mill, it might seem familiar to a card you've seen before. In the 2nd edition base game, we had Poacher, which is a cantrip that gives you a coin, and sometimes you will be forced to discard a card. So when you are discarding with Mill, that's sort of equivalent in some ways to having 2 poachers, where 1 pile is empty and you have to discard a card each time. So there are similarities between these 2 cards, but in reality they are very different. They play very differently at all. And that's not to say that we shouldn't look at those similarities. So cards that discard, usually seen as a negative, but as we explained in the Poacher video, there are times when it can be a positive instead. Now, we have gone over these before in the Poacher video, so I'm not going to spend too long on it, but just as a quick recap, sometimes you don't want cards in your hand. So, for example, Sentry can only trash cards from your draw pile. It cannot trash from your hand, so the cards you want to trash, you want them out of your hand and back into your draw pile. So cards that discard are useful for that. Poorhouse from Dark Ages. It gives you more money the less treasure cards you have in your hand. So if you have any treasure cards, you can discard them out of your hand before you play Poorhouse. Just gets you a little bit more money. Draw to X cards, really like cards that discard. A single Mill can discard 2 cards with only gaining 1 of them, so it can actually be more effective than Poacher at helping out draw to X cards. And of course, some cards have specific bonuses like Tunnel and Village Green when you discard them. And there may be more examples. You can check the Poacher video if you want me to go into a little bit more depth about these, but let's just move on. So one thing with Mill, very important, might not be immediately obvious, is that it is very consistent at hitting 5 coins on either turn 3 or 4 if you open with it. And that is going to depend on the other card that you buy as well. So if you bought Mill for your 4 and then you got a workshop for 3, then actually Mill stops being good at hitting 5. And the reason why this is the case is because when you have a 5-card hand, what you're doing when you choose to discard with Mill is that 2 of the cards in your hand, you are sort of replacing them with the equivalent of a copper. So that card ended up generating you 1 coin each. And it didn't cost you an action to do that. So that's a lot like copper. In your turns 3 and 4, it is very unlikely that you find, say, 3 estates in your hand. It can happen, but most of the time you're going to have 1 or 2 estates, so effectively treating those estates as if they were coppers in the early game makes it very, very good at hitting 5, because most of the rest of your deck is coppers, and so you end up with 5 cards that essentially all generated you 1 coin. Well, there's 5, and Mill is very good at that. Now, if you bought something like a workshop alongside it and you draw the Mill with the workshop, then suddenly you can't hit 5 anymore. And that is because when you're trying to hit 5 with Mill, you are relying on all 5 of those cards that you drew actually giving you some sort of economic benefit. And when they don't draw and they don't produce any money, they're not doing that. So do watch out for that. It's really important. But if you're looking to hit 5 early on, like there are key cards at that important price point of 5, then you might actually want to consider Mill. So a big benefit of choosing Mill over, for example, Silver, is that oftentimes what you find as you start to improve your deck and get it more towards what you want it to look like as the game progresses, sometimes you are you end up stuck with these early silvers that you don't necessarily want that well. Like, silver's good in the early game, but it gets worse as you go along. And the nice thing with mill is that you don't have these silvers in your deck in the mid-game, because the mill you could just revert to using it as a do-nothing cantrip, and then it's not counting as a stop card, right? So it sort of doesn't take up space in your hand in the way that a silver would. So if you need to hit 5 early, but the stop card space in your deck is quite low, then mill is very good as a replacement for silver, because you can get the early money to hit 5, and then essentially mill sort of gets out of your deck, so to speak. It's still in your deck, but essentially you can ignore it after a certain point and pretend it's not there by just playing it as a do-nothing cantrip. Now, without good draw, mill will struggle to actually hit above 5 on its own. So the reason for this is because when you are choosing to discard with mill, you are replacing cards in your hand for essentially 1 coin. And if you only have like a 5-card hand, then as you start to discard, because you've got to discard at least 2 cards with mill, so that gives you 2 coins, but then you've only got 3 other cards with which to get, for example, 6 more to hit province, and that actually can be pretty tough sometimes. Like 1 card, or 1 coin per card, is pretty inefficient when you want to try and hit pretty high price points. But, mill, you wouldn't want to make a deck just consisting of mills. Like, you're never going to get anywhere if you do that. I think people can sometimes go a little bit overboard on purchasing mills. They think, this is a victory card, it's worth a point. But the problem is, if you clog in a lot of mills into your deck, then sure, you can choose to not play them. You choose not to discard with them, but the problem is that, this is a very inefficient use of your buys. Buying all these mills that you're not really using, and mills that are only giving you 1 coin per card in your hand, is not super great unless you have a lot of draw. So it is very good, however, at hitting 5 consistently on its own. So let's look at Duke. Duke is this particular victory card in Intrigue, which is worth more points for every duchy that you have. And Duke requires you to build a very specific and unusual type of deck most of the time when you are trying to build a deck around Duke. And it is one that tries to hit 5 very consistently while also being crammed full of victory cards. Now, those cards are very hard to draw in them. So how do you hit 5 consistently? That's the big challenge with Duke. And mill is great because mill's very good at hitting 5 consistently without having to draw larger hand sizes. But if you're trying to go for something like province, which costs 8, then you really are going to need to get silvers and golds, because you need to get more than 1 coin per card in your hand. So this is like the big limitation of mill. If you buy it early on turn 1 or 2, and you can see how good it is at hitting 5, you might think to yourself, wow, mill is real good at like helping me hit 5 and getting these points. But that's sort of about the limit of what it can do. It's sort of not super great for getting much higher than that on its own. So don't fall into that trap with mill. So we need to talk about the 1 VP that is available on mill. This is a card that's worth a point. Even if you choose never to discard with a mill that you bought, it's still giving you 1 point, right? It wasn't just a do-nothing cantrip. It's a point as well. And it's important because it's a point that's also on a cantrip card. This means it's a point that isn't actually a stop card. In a way, you can think of buying a mill as being the equivalent of getting a single victory point token. It's not using up space in your deck. You still have the option to discard with it as well, but let's assume you're never discarding with it. Now, the problem is that paying 4 for 1 victory point is actually pretty high price point. Like Estate, yes, it's a stop card, but it only costs 2. And even then, Estate is not super great as a card. And you have to ask yourself, how good is 1 victory point anyway? This was talked about a lot. I have a video just after the base game series. I think it's video 27 about the base cards, where I go into a lot of depth about cards like Estate and Province and duchy, and I talk a lot in there about how valuable one victory point is. And the thing with Dominion is that games can vary very wildly in how the scores look at the end of the game. Sometimes you get things like a bridge megaturn, where one player has 8 provinces and the other one has none, and it looks like a total blowout, but the other player was actually going to win on their turn if they got the next turn. So the game was actually very, very close, but it doesn't look it. And then sometimes you get these games where the points are very, very close at the end. So one victory point is going to be much, much more useful on that latter type of game where the scores end up being very close. So games that have very few buys and gains, or they might even be what we call a singleton board where you only ever add 1 card per turn, those tend to have pretty close scores a lot of the time, you would think. And also, some games are very, very quick at 3 piling and gain almost no points at all. So these sorts of boards are ones that value 1 VP much more highly than others, and so Mill's going to be better for its points on those. There will be some boards where the 1 point from Mill just doesn't matter at all. So a lot of the time that's going to come up when you think of a board where players are fighting over the provinces, and if one person gets to 5 provinces versus 3, then they basically win. Well, that's a 12-point difference in those scores. And you know, what are the Mills going to do for you there? 1 point, it didn't matter, right? Because they beat you by another 11 points on top of that. So don't be lulled into a false sense of security by Mills points, right? Estate is bad, and even Cantrip Estate is still pretty bad. 1 point is not a lot of points at all. Usually, if you're going for some other form of victory points, you got to do better than 1 point, right? It's just very low. Now, Mill, we've talked about it being a do-nothing cantrip. One of the things with Mill is that its optional effect can sometimes be quite hard to use when you draw it, because you've got to discard 2 cards, and that's a lot harder sometimes than just discarding 1, because hopefully your deck is full of nice, good cards that you want to play. And Mill, because it can be played as a do-nothing cantrip, sometimes you will draw it, and you won't have anything else to discard it. So you'll think to yourself, well, okay, I would rather play the Mill, discard nothing, and carry on going through my deck looking for more cards, like more draw cards, for example. So sometimes you get cards like this, and with cards like this, you know, adding more copies of it into your deck will make it more likely that you draw the card at the appropriate time. So Mill is a card that benefits if you can get a bunch of them at sort of being a bit more consistent in being able to discard at some point during your turn if you have more. Problem is that Mill costs 4. So when we think about cards that are these like optional cantrips, or like do-nothing cantrips with an optional effect, they might be something like Pawn that costs 2, but Mill costs 4, and there's a lot of good stuff at that sort of price point. So Mill can have a pretty high opportunity cost. Then there are other games where you have like Ironworks and Workshop that just gain you 4 cost cards, and the opportunity cost is always going to be low. But if you don't have those around, you can spend a lot of money on just buying a load of Mills when you actually aren't using the discard effect in your game, and that's pretty inefficient. Like, you know, how good is a card that you're spending a decent chunk of money on only for you to not actually really use it for anything? Why are you spending 4 on a lot of cards that are basically like an estate? Right, that could be pretty bad. Now, the fact that it is worth a point helps mitigate this slightly, but bear in mind that, you know, Mill, it can be quite expensive for what you're actually getting for it sometimes. So take note of the opportunity cost that is around Mill. This is very important. I've mentioned it a few times now, but it really is. Mill is a card that can look really, really good. You know, it's green, it's got the point on it, and it's this cantrip, so wow, you know, these are great. Look, it's generating you money when you discard. That sounds fantastic. In reality, it might not be as good as you think, so do take care. Some cards do help draw victory cards really well. So we've looked at Patrol in a recent video, and there's also Vagrant from Dark Ages, and there are some other examples as well. But these cards have bonuses where essentially they draw victory cards into your hand very well, with the aim being that victory cards most of the time are these useless dead cards, but you're essentially cleaning up your upcoming draws and making them easier. Well, Mill is really nice with these cards because being if you use it as a do-nothing cantrip, what you're doing with the mill that you drew into your hand as a bonus is that you are essentially replacing it with some other card in your deck that you draw. What this means is that you can treat the bonus draw of the extra victory cards that you drew into your hand from Patrol and then swap them out for actual cards. And then instead of Patrol being something that drew you 3 good cards and then, say, 3 useless cards, it now became a card that drew you 6. And that's just way better because you actually got to get 6, hopefully, actually useful cards out of it, that one play of Patrol. So Mill goes really, really well with these sorts of cards, so do pay attention to when they're on the board. In addition to that, Mill likes big hand sizes with useless cards in it, like other victory cards, because it has this effect that lets it discard them for coins, right? So it's easier to find targets that Mill can be played on when you are able to draw a lot of victory cards very easily into your hand. So just at the end here, I'd like to show you some examples of cards, and we have talked about some of these, so this is just a reiteration of some, but also some other cards that go well with Mill. So Duke, again, just Duke requires you to build a very particular type of deck that wants to hit 5 over and over while not drawing very well, and that is a place where Mill shines specifically. Patrol, we just talked about that, but here it is again. It draws victory cards very well, and Mill works well with them. And Draw to X. Mill is very good with Draw to X. I know I mentioned it briefly on a slide where we talked about examples that were shared with Poacher, but Mill does very well with Draw to X. So I just wanted to show it again here to remind you again, watch out for Draw to X cards with Mill. It works very well with them. Ironworks is a card that was very early considered like combo in a way with Mill. So when you gain a Mill with Ironworks, you get both the action and victory benefits. So you get +1 card and +1 action. So Ironworks becomes this like cantrip gainer of Mills. And in some ways you can think of Ironworks becoming this like cantrip that's gaining you a point when you play it, as long as there are Mills left. And that's true to some extent. The Mills can then also be played as a cantrip, so none of these cards are taking up space in your deck. So Ironworks is all right with Mill, but how good is that really is going to depend on what else you could be gaining instead. If there are other really good 4-cost cards, then don't be too tempted by the fact that Ironworks gets this extra +1 card, because you might be better off adding actually useful cards into your deck instead of Mills that you're not really planning to play. Now, Groom, on the other hand, from Menagerie, this is similar to Ironworks. When you use it to gain Mills, you're gaining +1 card and +1 action, but you're also gaining a horse, and Groom is actually completely ridiculous with Mill. You can end games very, very fast. So this is a very similar strategy to the Ironworks Gardens Rush or Workshop Gardens, but it's Groom and Mill, and it goes really, really fast because you get a ton of draw with Groom, and you can just play a load of Grooms. Now, the thing that makes Groom way better than Ironworks at this is that Groom is also very, very good at gaining estates, because it gets a +1 action in the way that Ironworks doesn't. So Groom can empty itself and Mill and estates really, really quickly, and it's got all of these horses while it does it to draw and gain. So you play the Grooms more often, is what I mean to say. So, this is a genuine, real combo. Ironworks, it's okay to go well with Mill, and I do it a bunch, but Groom is like a real power with Mill. Do watch out for that when it's available. This tends to be the case with all 4-cost victory cards with Groom, but Mill is another really good one as well. It's also quite easy to hit 4 again to keep buying Grooms and Mills when you have that. And lastly, Silk Road. So Silk Road is this alternate victory card that can be really hard to actually use quite well, but Mill is very good with Silk Road because Mill doesn't take up any room in your deck, and so you might want a bunch of Mills anyway, and then Silk Road is just better because you've already got these extra victory cards in your deck. So Silk Road, it's only so good normally anyway, but Mill is a pretty good card to go with it. So that's it for Mill. So what we're going to do now is we are going to go over to the online client, and we are going to generate some random kingdoms that include Mill, and we're going to just assess what Mill brings to the table here. So let's take a look at this one. What do we have? We have trashing wise, we've got Masquerade, we've got Sentry, we've got Remodel. What's our deck going to be? So we've got Festival and Patrol to draw with, and it's going to give us buys and monies. We also have Festival and Minion, and so Minion is good with mill because it's draw to X, but Patrol is also good with mill because it draws you extra mills. And I'm not sure which one's going to be better here. I actually think I prefer Minion with festivals and mills. Maybe not as many festivals. How good is our trashing going to be? Well, we can draw all of the cards in our hand and we can selectively trash with mill and Sentry. That could be quite nice, but we're probably going to open with a Masquerade, to be honest. I think we would probably open with Masquerade and mill. I think that would be okay. You might draw the mill with your Masquerade and you'll be a bit sad. But I think it's still a risk worth taking. And we do want mills in this deck because I think no matter what strategy we choose, we are going to be using mill because it works quite well with both of these main draw cards. There is Council Room, but I can't imagine that we will get any of those. I do like the way that Minion attacks your opponent is quite nice here. Having a smaller hand size is also only 4 cards drawn at random. Can make Masquerade a little bit nastier. It's not like a discard down to 4 where they get to intentionally keep a bad card. It is a random 4 cards. So I think that tweaks me to going towards Minion. In addition to that, because it's draw to X, there is Lurker. So yeah, okay, I think there's just a lot of things that help draw to X work well here, and we have extra buys and good economy. Mill and Festival are giving us economy, and Minion as well for draw to X. Yep, so that's our deck. So Mill is a key part of this deck. It just means we get more out of our Minion plays. So we can discard the treasures and the estates and so on, any cards that we have left over, because we were not going to trash super quick. Maybe we don't even get a Sentry on that board. Anyway, enough about that one. Let's move on. So straight away I spot we have Chapel. This immediately draws my eye because it's so good. We have only Throne Room as a village, but that's okay because we have markets and we have mills. So Throne Room wants like Cantrip cards. Cards with at least +1 action on to treat it like a village, and we have mill, and we have market, and we have a torturer chain, and we have witch as well. Well, we've got Chapel to trash down. Torturer doesn't seem quite so good with Chapel. We get thin fast, and then the curses go into our hand, and they're very easy to keep thin with Chapel. So I actually think I prefer Witch, because then at least your opponent has to actually draw the curses, so they actually do hurt. But Torture's very good draw. On the other hand, our deck is really thin, so the extra draw from Torturer doesn't matter so much. So I'm going to want to hit 5. I'm going to open with Mill and Chapel. Am I going to do that? And let me just think. With Chapel, actually, I think it's okay because we don't have to trash absolutely everything as soon as possible with Chapel. So we're going to open Chapel and Mill. We are going to, if we draw Chapel and Mill together, well, that's fine. We just don't play the Mill. It would have been the same if we'd got, say, a silver. Otherwise, we're going to trash down quickly with Chapel, but we are going to leave so that we have 6 cards at some point. So that we can play a mill, we can discard the Chapel and something else, and hopefully we then have 3 more coppers in our hand, and we can use that to start buying a witch, and then markets, and then throne rooms. Maybe we get a throne room at some point first with mill, and then we can play like Chapel and witch, and we can start getting markets. And our deck's going to progress like that, and eventually we're just going to have this, lots of throne rooms, lots of markets, and we're going to play a couple of witches. The mill will sort of stop being useful, I think, at some point, because we're going to be very thin. But I think mill is good early on. I really sort of don't want a silver in this deck, because it's going to be some sort of like throne room market cantrip thing, ideally. I'm not sure that we will aim to generate more than 8 per turn, and we're just going to go 1 province. But I think that's the best thing to do here. It's a way that we get to consistently play witches over and over until they empty, and the fact that the curses go to the discard instead of the hand is something that's really important on a Chapel board. Like, Chapel counters Torturer pretty well, actually, sometimes. So Yeah, I think that's what we're going to do. So mill, you'll probably get 1 here. It's okay as a card. I can't imagine you getting more. You'd rather be picking up throne rooms when you hit 4, but it's good early on to hit 5. Now on this board, we have steward for trashing. It's just, technically there's like mine as well. What's our draw? Well, we've got courtyard and we've got a regular village type with mining village, so that's good. So we can draw our deck. And we have steward as well, actually, for draw. We don't have to go for courtyard. That's actually a lot better, I think. Is there anything we get to use with courtier? Yes, there's mill and there's harem, but I can't imagine we're getting... So it's harem, isn't it? I cannot imagine we're going to be getting harems. We could mine into them, but we're not going to do... Like, you could gain golds with courtier and then mine them into harems, but I think I'd rather just have the gold. Is Lurker good here? I don't think it is. I mean, what are we going to get? What we want to do is we want a steward to thin down. We want to then draw with mining village and steward. We're going to gain some golds with courtiers. We're going to have some mills. Maybe we do have lurkers, because how many buys do we have? We only have courtier as a buy. And we kind of want... The draw is not super great. So to draw all of this stuff that we want, we actually want to be gaining more of these that we can. So actually, I think once our deck starts to get under control, I'm happy to get 2 lurkers and just get that extra gain. Even though it's a lot of pressure on draw, the fact that we have the lurkers gaining us more cards will allow us to deal with that and then go beyond. So I think it's the better long-term play to get lurkers. We will have a courtier at some point. We will... Probably I don't know if it's actually worth trying to go above 1 province per turn. I don't think we can get like merchants quickly enough or anything else that generates us money quickly enough. Like, we could gain a bunch of golds, but I think we get 1 gold and then we start taking money and buy with a courtier. Do we even bother with buy? I think at first, but eventually we just want the money. And we're going to go for 1 province per turn. And it's going to be a nice thin deck. There's no attacks. That's how we're going to progress with that. So mill, is it good here? We want a mill to use our courtier on, but I'm not actually sure we're ever really going to bother to use it for discarding for any reason. Like, our draw's not super great, so we don't really have the card space to draw with or to use the discard on. And early on to hit 5, well, we've got steward that can spike a 5 once, which we only really need 1 5. And after that, we don't care so much. So no, so mill is only useful here in the fact that we are going to want to have 1 in our hand to play with courtier. Otherwise, we don't really care. Late in the game, we might be able to grab 1 with lurker for tie break if it's close. That actually might be the most important use of mill, funnily enough. Tie break points later on once our deck is going, because it's a cantrip, but otherwise it's fairly weak there, I think. Now here we have moneylender and upgrade and mine, all for trashing. I noticed straight away that the only plus buy is on council room. Where is the village? There is no village. Well, that's a problem straight away. So, what are we going to do here? So I think we would rather open moneylender than mill to start getting thin. It also helps us to hit 5. And we're going to want upgrade, and we're going to use that to thin a bit quicker. We're going to turn our estate into silvers, I think. We're going to get some labs. Eventually we can upgrade the moneylender into another lab. And we're just going to draw a bit, and we're going to try and hit provinces. And I might ignore mill completely here. Maybe I'll get 1 if I have 4 and nothing to spend on. Like, after your first mill, like, is secret passage better? Maybe mill will be nice once we have enough provinces, just so that we might draw like multiple provinces into our hand and we can just discard them to just be a bit more consistent on hitting 8. But I think secret passage is also probably going to be fine earlier on for 4. In fact, it might be slightly better earlier on for 4, I think, just to smooth out draws when we don't care that much. We do want to hit 5 a lot now. That is the case. But we have Moneylender, and we're going to open like Moneylender and Silver, and so I don't think Mill necessarily has a place. Maybe I'll get 1 or 2, but this is a very weak Mill board overall, is kind of what I'm trying to say. I suppose if we got Mill, well, no, we're going to have a Silver because we're spending our first 4 on Moneylender, but I was going to say it can be upgraded into Labs, but so can Secret Passage. Anyway, that's a pretty bad Mill board, I think. But gains are low. It's nice in that we can upgrade Silvers into Mills towards the end for tie-break points, but it's tough there how good Mill is. I think it's quite weak. This is the last kingdom. So Ironworks and Mill I immediately spot. So we can get a lot of Mills very easily. Trashing, the only trashing is Moneylender. And so we're going to want to open Moneylender instead. Would we want to open? I think we do. I think trashing is really important here because we've got like Minion as draw. What's our village? We've got Nobles and Throne Room, but we've also got like Library. The fact that we have Bandit, we have nothing, we have no plus buy, so we can only do so well. The fact, okay, so we've got Ironworks to gain a load of mills very easily, of course get us Throne Rooms, we have village support. We can use mill to discard with and support library. Is that good? I think I would rather use Minion instead of library if we're going to go down that route, but I think Minion makes it harder to use Throne Rooms pretty well because you only have these 4 card hands. It could be harder to utilise. You're more likely to dud because your hand size is never so big, unlike, say, library. I was being tempted at Bandit, but in reality, I think I'm not. I want 0 treasures in my deck. I want to be generating money from minions with Throne Room, which can help me get up to 8 pretty quick, and I don't need to go any higher. I may never get a Noble. I think just Ironworks. I think I get a Moneylender first. Then I start trying to gain as many Ironworks as I can, or possibly Lurkers as well. I'm just going to be buying like Ironworks and Lurkers until I have a whole bunch of these things. I can lurk minions, I can use Ironworks to get mills and Throne Rooms, and eventually I'll use that to hit 8. So mill is decent here. It's very easy to gain a bunch of them, and there's draw to X, and it's actually going to be one of our main sources of economy. So this is a very important board for mill, I think. So there you go, that's Mill. It's an alright card. It's not necessarily super important, but funnily enough, there's a lot of things in Intrigue expansion that actually work well with Mill. I think as you add more expansions, you start to see less and less of reasons for Mill to be particularly strong, but overall it's an okay card. I think it's overrated by newer players, but that doesn't mean that it's bad. It's middle of the road card, I think. I think that's probably the most fairest way of describing it. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. I hope it was useful for you, and I will see you next time. Thank you and goodbye.